I was actually really lucky in a weird sense, is that I was a high school phenom runner. I ran a 4-minute and 1-second mile in high school, which was the fastest time in the country in the United States at that point. I think 6th fastest high schooler ever at that point. And I was incredibly outcome focused because, like, who wouldn't? Like, I wanted to break 4 minutes in the mile and be like Roger Bannister and all these heroes that I had. And I never did. I got stuck there. And I think that was one of the greatest things. It was one of the hardest things, but also greatest things that happened to me, because I realized early on that chasing the outcome wasn't fulfilling. It just never was. It never was going to be. If I defined myself by the outcome, I was going to be miserable, even if I accomplished XYZ outcome that I got. So from an early age, I had to realize, and I had several other experiences in my life early on, wrote about them in the book that kind of capture this, but I had to realize early on that, like, it wasn't going to be fulfilling, and the people who I saw who still did it, who at some points were legends in the sport, decades later were still chasing, still kind of miserable. Like, by any external definition, they'd have success, but it was never freaking enough.
You are listening to My Rejection Story, hosted by Alice Draper. Welcome back to another episode of My Rejection Story. Today, I am joined by Steve Magness. Steve is a performance scientist, coach, and best-selling author who has worked with Olympians, military personnel, and pro athletes across every major sports league. Steve, welcome to the show.
Well, thanks so much for having me.
So, Steve, I think my first question I want to ask you about is something I wrote about, I think, in chapter 1 of your latest book, Win the Inside Game. You talk about choking, and I think it was choking that was the term you gave. And an example would be a college student or a high school student saying, if I studied, I'd get an A. Obviously, I didn't study, so I didn't get an A. And I love the way you kind of framed it and wrote about it in your book. And so I'd love for you to dive into a little bit, like, kind of defining what choking is and how it shows up. And is it like a way of, like, protecting ourselves from getting rejected? Is this like the first thing we can do to, like, self-reject and ensure we don't get rejected?
You're spot on. And this, the term choking often derives from sport where we see it, because it's right in front of us. It's someone who should be able to do something simple that they train to do, hit a baseball, throw a baseball, shoot the ball into the basket, whatever have you. And then for whatever reason, because of the pressure and expectations, they can't. But it shows up outside of sport. And the example you gave there is a perfect one, which is kind of this, is we really kind of fear being rejected or falling short, especially if it's public information. This is why it shows up in sport so much, because you play games in front of an audience. No one chokes in practice, or it seldom occurs, right? We don't choke when we're staring at our book or trying to write something. Eventually we'll figure it out, okay? What happens is that public persona, that understanding that we're being judged, kind of activates this kind of defense mechanism we have in our brain that says, like, hey, if I try, I might come up short. I might be shown or labeled a failure. So in response, often what we do is we self-protect. And one of the main ways we do that is we self-sabotage. You see this all this time in college students. What do? They have the exam and they should be studying and they put it off into the last minute. And then sometimes they don't even study. And then afterwards that gives them an excuse. In my preferred sport of running, what do? You go to your local road race and someone will say, well, I haven't really been training for this. Because if they trained for it and they showed up and then the result was like all on them. So often we like pre-build in these excuses as a way to kind of like soften the blow and protect our ego a little bit if failure does kind of hit us.
Yeah. I love how you explained it. So thank you for that definition. And softening the blow, protecting our ego, is very much, I think, in line of what we're doing. And I have so much respect for people that do the opposite of choking. So like I had someone on this podcast a couple of weeks ago, Jude Sack, and I basically had discovered him because he put up this like reel where he was figuring out how he was tracking down, oh my gosh, I'm forgetting his name now. He was tracking down a celebrity whose name I've forgotten to try and see if the celebrity would give him a job interview because he was like a big fan of him. And so he created like the series, like Unrejectable. And so he's going through this like public humiliation ritual kind of, and like documenting his process of doing something that's definitely almost definitely going to lead to rejection. It actually didn't. And so when I see stuff like that, I just have so much immense respect for these people who are building in public and they haven't like gotten to that destination yet where like maybe they now have their best-selling book or they have like all these accolades. They're actually in the process of getting there. But I can see why people don't do it. It's incredibly vulnerable. It's incredibly hard. Very few people get past the choking. I'd say less people get past the choking phase than the ones who kind of hold themselves back because they're scared of that public rejection, as you described it. So if someone is listening and they think like that might be me, maybe I'm the person that's not trying because I'm scared of choking, I'm scared of something happening publicly, what are some steps that they could take to try thrive, not survive?
Yeah, so that's such a good example and such a good framing, and I think it actually gives us some useful tools. First off, before I get to that one, I think of it as like your brain's kind of like a muscle, right? If we go to the gym and we train the thing, we get better at the thing. And the same is true when we're looking at facing rejection, facing public failure, humiliation, whatever it is if we go into the arena, we step into the arena and say, hey, I'm going to do this thing, knowing that I potentially might fail and knowing that like it might make me look like a failure or what have you, our brain kind of takes that normally hypersensitive alarm that goes, hey, don't do this, run away, like hide, don't be public. And it turns it down just a little bit. It's never going to go away, but it turns it down so it's manageable. Now, the key thing here is just like if you're going to lift some weights or run on the treadmill at the gym, you don't go and pick the biggest weight up on day one or crank that treadmill up to the insane speed on day one. You start with something that is manageable. So maybe for you or the audience listening, maybe manageable isn't like, getting on stage in front of a ton of people. Maybe it's saying, hey, I'm going to have a friendly audience. I'm going to invite, 5 to 10 of my, close friends. And then I'm going to give whatever it is, my comedy routine, my pitch, my whatever you want to do publicly. But you have this friendly audience. And actually, this is how we kind of learn. I have 2 toddlers at home here. And what I've noticed with them is they go through the same sort of stuff. And actually, there's some brilliant research on persistence in toddlers that backs this up from Dr. Kelsey Luca that essentially says once we get to around 1 or so like that, when we're trying new skills, we look to mom and dad for like the approval and the reaction. This is why if a toddler stumbles and falls and they see mom or dad get up and run after and are like, oh, are you okay? Are you okay? They start crying often. But if they stumble and fall, and granted, hopefully it's not a big stumble or fall, but just a minor one, and they see dad and mom being like, it's okay, like get up, they realize like, okay, this isn't like a catastrophe. I can get up. So we're always kind of looking for that external model. It's just when we're really young, we have friendly audience. And then as we grow, the audience isn't so friendly. So what I tell people is take small steps and then rig your audience so it's small and friendly at the beginning. And I think if you kind of do those two things, you set yourself in a positive place. And then I think the other thing that really helps here that your guests kind of get at is like, rig the constraints or environment around you to not push you towards, avoidance or not doing the thing, but kind of incentivizing the opposite. So he created kind of a quest where, yes, in the end, he didn't want to get rejected, but even if he did, something good still came out of it. Because he's got like this series, this like adventure, this thing. And that's what I often see is with good athletes or good performers or good musicians or what have you, is they kind of reframe the thing. Instead of the end result on win or losing being the defining characteristic, it becomes like, all right, I might not get the book deal. I might not make the bestseller list, but I'm going to go on this journey to explore, and the exploration is the entire freaking point. And that kind of, again, softens the blow and gives you a definition of success that can work even if you come up short.
Yeah, this is fantastic. Okay, so you write about in the book to adopt a quest mindset, and I think that this is what you're touching on, which is be obsessed with the journey, not necessarily that end result, which you can't really control. You can take actions that might increase the chances, but there are too many uncontrollable variables. And then some of the other stuff you shared that's very in line with what I often say when I talk about building rejection resilience is the small and friendly audience. I love that. So, like having someone in your corner, some form of community, I think can increase the resilience a great deal because we're scared of being isolated and alienated from our community when we take risks and when we build up that rejection muscle. And then the small steps, starting small. I love that. On the external model with that example you gave of toddlers, it made me think of another example in your book where you write about, I think it was a case study where something hit like someone's boots or something. So like a nail went through a worker's boot or something like that. And they went to hospital and kind of reacted as if like the nail went through their foot. But when it was actually taken apart, it was discovered that it went like between their toes and never actually touched their skin. But what they felt was like a nail went through their foot because we are such extrinsic beings and we see and our brain kind of perceives, just like the toddler. If parents look alarmed, they're going to assume that they're in danger. And if the parents are like, good job, well, everything's okay, they assume they're safe. Could you talk to me a little bit, kind of, like the science there and how that can influence our ability to take risks? Like if we are with a very anxious community, is that going to influence our risk-taking ability? Do we need to find a community that's a little bit more regulated and will reassure us?
Absolutely. I'm so glad you brought this up. So the way I like to frame it is like our brain is predictive, okay? And it's making those predictions based on the best information it has. What kind of information sources? First off, like your past, your history. Is there anything you've been through that is, similar to this? And then the current information it's taking in. So in that famous like boot nail example, the person sees the nail in the boot and assumes my foot is in the boot. And the brain goes like, this is supposed to hurt. So I'm going to create the sensation and respond as if it hurts, even though like there was no actual nail in the foot. And we see this in all sorts of different areas where kind of like your brain sometimes latches on to the wrong information. And I'm glad you brought up the environment around you because this plays a really big factor. And again, if we look at the research in sport, it shows this very clearly. There's been a couple studies on both youth, high school, and elite sport that shows that if a coach is freaking out on the sideline, then the players start to inhabit whatever their emotion is. So if they're freaking out, the players themselves feel more stressed and anxious and start playing like they're stressed and anxious, meaning they're more avoidant, hesitant, all those things. If a coach is calm, cool, and collected or confident on the sideline, that transmits as well. And players are more likely to kind of be risk-taking. Taking it away from sport, there's all sorts of crazy cool data that has looked at parents and kids playing, for instance, on a playground. Is if you frame the playground as like, oh no, like, again, with nuance here, but like if you go on those monkey bars, you're going to die, then kids are less likely to take risks. Okay. If you frame it as like, hey, we're going to learn how to take appropriate risks. Like, no, don't go off the huge slide or whatever if it's not age appropriate. But if it is, like, sometimes you're going to fall off the monkey bars and hurt yourself a little bit. And like, that's okay. Kids tend to have lower anxiety and be more resilient. And I think even more so is they start to calibrate that kind of risk reward calculation. And I think we see that in the real world as well, is that part of the point of coming up to the line of failure or potentially crossing it and doing something that we might not have the capabilities to do yet is that helps us calibrate kind of our risk reward and where our capabilities lie. If we never go up to that point, it's like the person who signs up for, a fun run and says, hey, I'm just going to walk the whole way. They might finish that fun run, but they never kind of see how good they could be by like just pushing the bounds a little bit. And sometimes they're going to push too far and maybe have to slow to a walk because they overestimated it. But that information then gives us more and better predictions for the future so that we know, hey, next time I enter this race or take on this thing, last time I went out a little too hard or went out way too easy, and I can kind of fine tune and calibrate it. We've got to go through those experiences to kind of like fine tune and figure out, where our capabilities lie in that task or in endeavor.
Love the way you framed kind of calibrating that risk reward association and people who are able to do this. I think I constantly feel like I have a lot to learn from. I want to dive into examples where maybe the listener hasn't had a lot of examples of people that have managed to calibrate the risk reward association. So as you were talking, what came to my mind is a friend of mine who I've been friends with for decades, and she was incredibly anxious, and I felt like she wanted to do a lot of things in her life. But her anxiety stopped her. So she'd be like, I want to travel, but like then she'd pull out a few weeks before. And I always knew this is something that she wants, but there's this anxiety sort of stopping. And later I realized that her mother is like 10 times more anxious than she is and was like freaking out about like a million different things. And so when you talk about like that monkey bar association, I would imagine that she grew up in this environment where her mother thought she's going to die when she's like holding onto the monkey bar. So like, don't hold onto the monkey bar. So if someone has been in that environment and they maybe haven't seen a lot of like risks leading to rewards because the people around them have just modeled not really taking risks. How can they work on calibrating that risk reward association?
Yeah, so that's actually a great question. So I think there's a couple things that come to mind. First off, if you look at some of the more recent research on, anxiety in that case, what they found is there's what we call like a interoception problem. That's a really fancy word for meaning like, are you good or bad at reading the internal signals? And what I mean by that is we're all inundated with signals or feelings or emotions at all sorts of parts of the day. And some of us get really good in slicing and dicing those apart. So for instance, if I feel some tension in my shoulders, that could mean that I'm stressed, or it could mean like I'm angry, or it could mean like I'm just tired. And people with high interoception are able to like link that feeling to the appropriate like emotion or the thing that's coming at them. We see this all the time in sport where you have to decide like, is this like discomfort in my legs? Does it mean I'm just getting tired? Or does this mean like I'm about to pull my muscle and need to stop? Like one, you want to stop. One, you say, hey, I can keep pushing for a little bit. You're reading those those signals. And what research shows is that people with anxiety often like can't read that signal very well and often jump towards like there's a sensation of discomfort, and this means like real threat and danger. Okay, so they almost have like a hypersensitive alarm. So I think understanding that, it goes back to what we kind of talked about earlier, which is like your mind is like a muscle. We need to find safe places where you can kind of sit with those experiences. This is why mindfulness training is so big right now, because all you're doing is saying, hey, I'm going to sit down, maybe close my eyes, do whatever, and I'm just going to sit with whatever feeling comes up. And what research tells us is that just by simply sitting with it and not reacting to it, your brain kind of gets better at that interoception where it says, okay, I'm feeling a little bit of anxiety and stress. This doesn't mean I need to jump towards like hit the eject button, run away. I can just sit with it and experience it and kind of listen to my body a little bit. The second thing that I think is really helpful here, and this gets to something we talked about as well, but it's like, you want to rig your environment around you to make everything else kind of sending the signal that I'm safe. Meaning the people around you, the like where you're taking those risks in, your support system on where you feel that anxiety, who are you going to call, who are you going to, communicate. To use way too many sports examples, it's like if we're playing at a home field versus like at a away field, like our rivals field where everyone's going to be booing and jeering at us. We want everything around us to kind of signal home field and make it kind of easier to get going. So for your friend example, I would say, maybe the thing isn't to say, hey, I'm going to go take a week-long trip to another country. Maybe I'd say, you know what? I'm going to call up 5 of my best friends, and for the weekend, we're going to drive to a place that's an hour or two away and stay at an Airbnb, and we're going to start there. And maybe you need to start earlier, but like you're looking for those bite-sized chunks with support that allows you to kind of take that step so that your brain rewires and says like, okay, that wasn't life or death. Like I made it through. Like we can handle this.
Yeah, thank you. It relates to what you said earlier about kind of the brain being a muscle, and you're not going to go straight for the heaviest deadlift the first time you go to the gym. We're going to start maybe with some dumbbells and do kind of 2-kilogram lifts if you've never stepped foot in the gym before and build up from there. So I love that. And touching on so you spoke about who you're around being quite important, and I want to shift to what you talk about in your book as well, which is the modern world has replaced a lot of deep connections with lots of shallow ones. We've become intimate strangers, is something that you write about in the book, and I just found it really interesting when you were writing about that, and it brought up a lot of thoughts. And one thing that kind of I thought about, that it was a conversation I recently had with my 89-year-old grandfather. And my 89-year-old grandfather told me that people were not as interested in their careers in his generation as what he's observed in his grandkids and his kids, but like especially his grandkids. So they were quite content with much more humble lives. Like, okay, like I've got my job, it's going to be the same job for the next whatever. And I've got this like 2-bedroom house, and like I've got my neighbors. And then something I've observed generationally between my grandfather and our generation is that he is a lot more community oriented. He and my grandmother knew like 300 relatives. They had like 300 people at their wedding. I didn't know relatives. I don't know where those relatives went, but they weren't in my life. I kind of knew my nuclear family and my first cousins. And there are things that you do, like, a neighbor has a problem, you come let them stay. Like a lot of acts of service and inconveniencing yourself for your community. And when I thought of that generational difference, I was like, there's no cultural difference. This is really just generational differences that have made us a lot more individualistic. I'd love for you to talk to that and whether that actually influences how we relate to rejection or how our rejection sensitivity.
Absolutely. That's such a beautiful and poignant story because I think it gets at the problem of modernity. I'm gonna paint broad brushes here, but for most of human history, we functioned in the way your grandparents did. Meaning, like, we had lots of local community. We lived in a kind of local society. Yeah, we had global stuff, always have. But, like, your world centered around those who you knew in the real world. And because of that, you form these bonds and these connections in this trust where you could say, hey, like, Johnny down the street needs some help. I'm going to help them. Or, I need some help with my kids. Like, I'm going to rely on, the old lady down the street that's been so kind to us. And now I would venture if people even think, like, in their local neighborhood or community, you probably can't name half the people on your street. And that's the shift that has occurred. And I think we kind of evolved for the local in-person community, but what we now live in is like a global society that almost fools us into thinking we have connection because we sign on to social media and we have all these people we call friends or followers, and we might know some of them like casually, but there's not that like deep bond there. And what research overwhelmingly tells us is that one of the best predictors of mental health is like the community and support around us. In fact, there was a study I was looking at last week that was looking at why people who frequent church and religious services often have higher sense of well-being. And they looked at all these things. They were like, well, is it the religious belief, the praying, or what have you? And it literally, most of the explanation came down to the fact that, like, if you regularly attended church, you were more likely to have like 10 close friends because it forced you to be around people. And I think that's great if you're religious, but like some people don't attend church and aren't religious, and like we don't have that inbuilt community. So to me, it comes down to, again, like the community has always signaled safety and support. So if you go way back and you look at ancient human on the savannah, you were screwed if you were out hunting by yourself, like in a lion or tiger or whatever showed up. If you had like, a couple dozen of your close friends, maybe you're kind of still in trouble, but you had a chance to figure it out. And you were going to survive, whether it's that against that lion or tiger or against the famine that comes or whatever problem faced. You have a better chance of surviving with others. And I think that's why we have this deeply ingrained need for connection and belonging. But instead, we've replaced it with like the superficial version. It's almost like we need to eat our fruits and vegetables, but instead society has just given us like, M&Ms and candy, and we're mistaking it as like, oh, I'm getting my calories in, I'm good. But underneath, like, we're in a lot of hurt and trouble. And I think that contributes to the kind of anxiety or fear of rejecting or rejection, because like we don't have that support around us to lift us up, even if we fall short.
Yeah. I think like your exploration of the problem of modernity is a very interesting framework to understand like where how fear of rejection can be heightened in a society that, according to a lot of research, is more lonely than ever before. So yeah, I love that you kind of explored that, and community signaling, safety, support, and something I often talk about in terms of rejection is like there is that ancient part of our brain that knows that we needed that tribe to survive, as you spoke about in the savannah. Like, if the tribe ousts me, which is what we fear when we fear rejection, that could mean losing access to shelter, safety, food, everything that one needs to survive. And
So
yeah,
can I take this a step further? My mind just went to it, but I think this is important. It's like, you can take this even from humans and all the way look at like our close cousins like chimpanzees and apes and other things like that. If you look at, so in the modern world, we've in social media land, we've often been inundated with this idea of like, men being alphas and all this stuff. If you look at the research, what they've actually found in chimpanzees and bonobos and other apes is that the most likely person to console others in the group after they fail, that could be a failed confrontation, a failed fight, whatever in chimpanzee land, the most likely person to console is the leader, is the so-called alpha person. I think it was Franz de Waal who studied it, who called them the healer in chief. And
wow.
what they realized is that like part of the power of the group is like we're all gonna fall short. That could be in chimpanzee world fighting, but in our world, like, maybe not getting the food that we want to, not get, rising in the status or ranks or whatever it is that we want to. And we need that support system that allows us to kind of handle that rejection and get back on the horse, because the worst thing you want is the person who went out for a hunt to fail and then say, nah, I'm never hunting again, because you just lost someone valuable. So what do? They console them, they prop them up, and they say, hey, come on out with us again. We're going to do better. And we can even see this biologically in modern research, which shows that like after, especially in sport, but after a tough loss, we often have like heightened stress hormones like cortisol and things like that. Affiliation, meaning bonding with others, going to have that team meal, shooting the shit in the locker room, whatever have you. That is one of the best ways to decrease that post-stress cortisol, because it releases oxytocin, which kind of counterbalances it. And like the quicker we kind of release that, there were some studies on rugby players that found that the quicker we kind of turn that stress signal off and get back into like a productive signal, the better we're going to play in the next game a couple days or a week later. So I think it gets at the central part of what you're trying to get at in your argument here is that like the community doesn't just help us take risks. It kind of gets us back to normal after we take a risk and we potentially fail and we feel bad about ourselves. Those around us allow us to get out of that sad state and get us back into a place where it's like, okay, on to the next, let's keep going.
I love that you dived into the science of this, because I don't know the science. I just know that it works, like from like a purely like individual level. If I have gone and now like a bad rejection, maybe it's like someone said something rude to me, talking to someone about it, especially someone I respect, so that like I think feeds into your alpha theory, which is like if I speak to someone whose opinion I respect, whose judgment I respect, and not someone who is just going to validate me no matter what, that is like immediately like feels like the nervous system's regulated. You kind of see clearly like the whatever flawed perspective I had feels like it's kind of ended. And so that release of oxytocin makes total sense. So thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's fascinating. So again, I'm way too many sports, but if you watch Good Coaching, you were recording this after the NCAA basketball tournament just ended, but there's so many great examples of where like an athlete is kind of like spiraling, they miss some shots. And then you see the coach like get right in front of them, like eye contact, and then often say something like, hey, I believe in you. And it sounds like really corny to us. But when you're in the moment and you're spiraling and you've got that direct eye contact, which also contributes to oxytocin, and you have someone, to your point, you often respect your coach in a good team, and these are good teams. you've got someone whose opinion you value, who wants you to perform and get better and cares about you, saying like, I believe in you, like you're capable of this. And it turns the people around. And I think too often in life, like we don't have that. But if you think about not only in sport, but chances are sometime in school, and I know this happened to me in writing, like you do poorly on assignment, and then some teacher comes up and says, hey, like, this is really good. Like, if you put some work in, like, you've got a future in that. And that lights that spark where you're essentially like, it turns you around and you're like, okay, like, I can do this. And I think we all need those people in our life because we're all going to face like those hard points or those rejections at some point. They're inevitable in life.
Yeah, yeah. And so I love that you give that example of sports and also of schools. And so there's two things I want to share quickly. One is I read a study somewhere, and I'm going to look for it to link in the show notes. But basically, what I remember about the study was that the researchers went into some schools and told the teachers, you probably know about this study, told some teachers that there are, maybe you can share it. You can probably share it in better if the where they told teachers that some students have potential, and then can you share some details about the study?
Yeah, sure. Off the top of my head, essentially what they did is they had them they told a group of students that essentially these were the kind of gifted students with potential, and they made up some fake scores on tests, and then they told they told teachers these other kids like weren't like they didn't have much potential, like they weren't doing too well, and it was all made up. But what happened is the teachers started like paying attention to the students who had potential and shifting their behavior, even though they didn't know often or recognize it. And at the end, the people who were simply labeled as higher potential perform better and improved on an actual test. And what this gets at is exactly what I think you're trying to point out here, is that like the perception matters. Having someone say like, hey, you got potential here, or like you're capable, you can do this stuff. It sounds very kind of like cliche, but it really does matter, especially I think in our modern world where kids are not only just comparing. You know, you and I kind of grew up in a world where elementary school, it's like, if you're the fastest in your class, you're the fastest in your class. If you're the best at math in your class or very good, like you're competing against whatever, 20 other kids. Nowadays, like that kid who thinks they're really fast or great at math can go online and be like, oh, I kind of suck. Like, because the comparison is too big, right? So it's very easy to kind of beat ourselves down. So I think we have to keep in mind that study that shows like we need people that kind of convey like we have potential. There's stuff here. Here's a path forward. And we do so, we're more gritty and resilient. When we don't feel like anybody cares or there's a path forward, we kind of just default to shutting down and not trying.
Which is so sad, like when you think of the number of kids who maybe don't have parents that instill that in them, and don't have that system that can help them. And so what also came to mind, that was the second thing I wanted to share, was leaders. I think that like probably most people listening can agree that leaders of high performing teams are often able to instill that sense of self-belief in their teams. And so that means like if someone fails, they try something and they fail, the leader is like, look, I believe in you, and like you tried something new and here's where you went wrong, but like you're super capable or whatever. And leaders who generally do a bad job at leading would be the ones that are only focusing on like everything that their employees do wrong and like being super hypercritical without any constructive feedback, or identifying the strengths in their team. Yeah, so
exactly. It's sorry, you can go ahead.
Oh, no worries. If you have something to share, you can go ahead.
No, I have something to share on all of this stuff. So I love where we're going here. But you're spot on. And there's a study on this when they looked at rugby players after a game, where they saw if they had a coach come in there and just like essentially tear into everything that went wrong and kind of beat them down afterwards, their hormonal profile switched and like high stress levels, and that predicted worse performance. If they came in and said like, hey, we get it, here's some stuff that you did well, even though that we lost and we can improve on, and they were kind of encouraging, we saw less cortisol and more kind of testosterone and adrenaline increase, which shows like a desire to compete again, which is what we want. No one's saying like ignore all the mistakes, but if you look at great leaders or great programs, especially after losses or tough performances, they often have a system in place that allows you to get towards constructive. This is why the military has after action reviews. Those after action reviews, they don't focus on like, hey, you suck as a person. Like, what are you doing? No, they say, hey, we're going to take this out of us. Great. This occurred. How do we get better as a collective group without blaming anybody? And that's the key, because that allows you to learn, but also not put you in that like sensitive state of like, oh my gosh, I just screwed up. And if you stay in that, oh my gosh, I just screwed up, it almost becomes like a trauma response where next time you're in a similar situation, your brain remembers like, hey, remember last time we screwed up and we got reamed out by our leader or coach or whoever it is, and you just shut down. Where if instead you say, hey, last time I screwed up, but my boss helped me get through it, and they help me understand how to do this, you don't go towards that kind of trauma response. You go towards like, hey, resilience, like, hey, let's take it on. We can figure this out.
Yeah. I hope some leaders are listening and taking notes. Yeah. Because it's hard. Like I think people, as we kind of unpack it, it makes total sense. And I think that so many leaders get so caught up in like the KPIs of like what the company metrics are, and not realizing that you're stifling or you're not giving room for employees to learn and grow from any mistakes that have happened. I want to talk about capitalism, because I know that you wrote about in your book something that I haven't seen. So like, okay, that's a big word. Capitalism is a big word. So I'm segueing here, but you wrote about in your book, I think you said that the founder of capitalism warned of the risks of a hyper-individualistic society, which I think speaks to that modernity problem that we were talking about earlier. And so what kind of has brought my brain here is also partly kids these days. You mentioned having the comparison being huge because they have all this information online to find that there's like thousands of kids better at maths than them, and they're not the best just because they're the best in their classroom. So in a society that is overly, I guess, more success driven than previous societies, how do we this might be a big question, but does it make it harder to have like connection, to build up greater sense of community that allows us to come back from rejection, that not being have a greater local in-person community, greater rejection resilience? Does capitalism make that harder?
Yeah, that's a big question, but I'll try to answer it best I can. So I'm not the economist. My brother's actually an economist. So it was interesting writing this thing. But what I found is that Adam Smith, kind of the founder of capitalism, he warned of going like, we're going to simplify it, but too far in one direction, meaning like all individualistic or all win at all costs. He kind of argued in his books for like a counterbalance. Where that counterbalance lays might be different for every individual person, but I love this because the guy who kind of like set us off at this win at all costs situation is saying like, hey, hold up, like there's some warning signs here. If we go too far in this direction without support in the other side, we're going to end up kind of miserable. And he gives some great examples of this in his books, which are just fascinating that I wrote about. But to me, I think it does make it more difficult. And there's some great, and don't get me wrong, there's some great things about like success driven and winning and all that stuff. I'm a sports guy. I love to win. But at the same point, the argument I'd make is there is a reason, again, to lean way too heavy into sports, but there is a reason that legendary coaches like Nick Saban say, don't focus on the outcome, just worry about the process. Or John Wooden, the basketball coach, says, don't think about winning. I never talk about winning. Or the great football coaches, Bill Walsh, who wrote a book that was titled "The Score Takes Care of Itself." And these are all people who won a lot and won a lot of championships in a competitive arena that was actually like you win or lose. But they're saying the same thing, which is if we obsessively focus on outcomes, we're going to get in our own way. Why? Because if you look at the psychology and biology, is when we flip our motivation systems to all the way outcomes, we essentially live in that kind of like survival mode where it's like our brain goes, oh, if we don't win this game, it's the equivalent of death. And maybe not actual death, but like maybe, status death, where now we're not the star athlete. And when we live in that place and our brain thinks that's how we judge success or failure, then it's going to create that hypersensitive alarm we talked about. And you're going to be more risk averse because a loss means psychological death. So instead, what these great coaches and Adam Smith realized is that like, we got to counterbalance that pull. And that counterbalance of the pull could be community. It could be like, we're going to focus on the quest and journey, which we talked about. It could be, I'm going to focus on the process and becoming someone who takes risks and does these things in the way actionable. All of these things are just counterbalancing our natural kind of capitalistic world that we live in. We don't need to focus on outcomes because the rest of the freaking world is telling us to focus on outcomes. We need to have that counterbalance. And I think that's more important now than ever because, again, we live in a social media world where like you are measuring up against the greatest in the world instead of in your local community. If you don't have that counterbalance, you're gonna end up burned out and probably not performing as well as you would if you didn't.
Love to ask you a personal question, Steve, because you are someone who has a lot of successful metrics, extrinsically successful, like what people would define as extrinsically successful. How do you counterbalance the how do you counterbalance not focusing overly on external outcomes? What does that look like for you?
I was actually really lucky in a weird sense, is that I was a high school phenom runner. I ran a 4-minute and 1-second mile in high school, which was the fastest time in the country in the United States at that point. I think 6th fastest high schooler ever at that point. And I was incredibly outcome focused because like who wouldn't? Like I wanted to break 4 minutes in the mile and be like Roger Bannister and all these heroes that I had. And I never did. I got stuck there. And I think that was one of the greatest things. It was one of the hardest things, but also greatest things that happened to me because I realized early on that chasing the outcome wasn't fulfilling. It just never was. It never was going to be. If I defined myself by the outcome, I was going to be miserable, even if I accomplished XYZ outcome that I got. So from an early age, I had to realize, and I had several other experiences in my life early on, I wrote about them in the book that kind of capture this, but I had to realize early on that like, it wasn't going to be fulfilling. And the people who I saw who still did it, who at some points were legends in the sport, decades later were still chasing, still kind of miserable. Like by any external definition, they'd have success, but it was never freaking enough.
Yeah.
So what that made me do is it like made me kind of built a life where it was like outcomes are nice, like I'm human, but I got to do things that are interesting. And I think that, in my current career of writing, that kind of has come off is like, I don't write the book that's going to sell me the most books. I write the book that is like interesting enough where I want to go on the journey and figure the thing out. And I hope enough people are interested in it that they read it, obviously. But that's the book that I write. And that's how my first book that I ever wrote was this very technical book called The Science of Running. And it was like a deep dive on running, like runner's nerd's paradise, where if you're not a running nerd, you're going to pick it up and be like, what in the world is this? It's so confusing. But I wrote that book because I was in grad school. I have all this information on running. Every other running book that I picked up was like, they were good, but they were like kind of the beginner's guide to running a marathon. And I said, you know what? I want to write the book that is like goes into the weeds and just like outlines it all. So I did. And I got rejected by like every agent who read the thing and said, this thing will never sell. So I just self-published it because I was like, whatever. I was 20 something. I wanted out in the world. And it sold something like 80,000 copies, which
Wow.
for a self-published book with way too many typos because I didn't know what I was doing and highly technical, like I was like, okay, that's a lot. And the point is, like, I didn't write it to sell 80,000 copies. I had no idea. I wrote it and didn't succumb to the pressure of, and some agents told me this. They're like, I'll take you on if you write like the beginner's guide to running. And I was like, no, that's not the book I want to write. Like, this is it at this point. Maybe someday I'll write the beginner's book on running, but that's not. I took it on because that was the interest. And if you look at every book I've written since then, it's the same. Is like, that's why I go far and wide in research and psychology and sport and parenting. And I'm not trying to pigeonhole myself. I'm just like, what's interesting? And that's what I'm going to do. And if it sells a lot, great. If it doesn't, like, that's okay. I'll be okay. And I'm fortunate to have now, not back then, but now have the financial stability to do that. But I think one of the reasons that I've had success is because I haven't succumbed to, I'm going to write this to sell the most books or get the most accolades or get the most likes and followers. No, I'm going to pursue my interests and go on that exploration and see where it takes me.
That's incredible. And this, I think, speaks to like that intrinsic motivation that you write about in your book. Like, you're intrinsically curious about the science of running all those years ago and the topics that you explored in your later books. And that also, I think, can make it easier to push through the harder parts of writing and publishing a book than when you are doing it for like an extrinsic reason, and then it gets difficult. You talk about, and this is something you talked about in your recent book, is how some writers and creators get stuck after they create something that has now been a success, because this has led to an identity of, you are now a very successful author or a very successful singer or a very successful painter. Example, To Kill a Mockingbird, Harper Lee, I think she wrote a book in 2015, but it took her decades and decades and decades to write a book after To Kill a Mockingbird was published. Did you ever feel crippled by your success?
I think I did very early on. As I said, not so much in writing, but in running I did, because I kind of defined myself as like runner. And for a couple of years it was like hard, because it's like I'm trying to like be that person who replays the hits. You get the hit song and you're like, okay, how do we play this again? Like, how do we copy this? And that left me feeling stuck. And I think actually writing coming out of that helped, because I realized that like the endeavor is your expression of it. So the goal isn't to write the hit or to tie my identity to like writer or runner or whatever have you. the goal is to say, like, this is a part of my journey, but I'm ever evolving. And I may always love running or writing or whatever it is, but like how I express that can shift and change. And I think you see this in really good musicians who, like, we sometimes pigeonhole them into like, this is your style. And they say, no, like, I'm just like, I love music. I'm going to explore music and see where that takes me. And these people have often long and fulfilling careers, and sometimes really successful. Sometimes it's like successful enough extrinsically, but they just, for 50 years, they love playing and exploring music. And that, I think, is what it's all about. So same with me on writing is like, I just try to see it as like, I'm exploring ideas, and I'm not going to pigeonhole myself as idea. And I remember having this conversation. I wrote a book a couple years ago called Do Hard Things that took off. And people were like, well, are you going to write Do Hard Things too? Because like sequels sell better, right? Essentially,
Yeah.
I'm like, no, that's not interesting. Like, you gotta go where it's interesting. I was like, that sounds lame. I've already explored this topic. Let's go explore another topic. Now, sometimes it is an adjacent topic and related, but it's always going on that exploration that matters, which tying it into your identity is the same point. Is like, we're always kind of the same person, but we're always ever evolving. And if you think back, you realize like, I'm a different person than I was in high school or college. I mean, thank God in some cases, but like, we're always evolving, and that's how it should be. And that's how it should be in our craft as well.
This is amazing. So I would like to tell readers to read the Win the Inside Game, which is the book that I read. And I think that like my big takeaway, if anyone is unsure what their big takeaway is from this episode, my big takeaway is to treat your goals, life, like a quest, a journey, a series of tiny experiments, rather than be overly focused on an extrinsic or external outcome. Steve, for listeners who really are curious and want to, because I feel like I could keep talking to you for hours and there's so much research, you obviously know so much information. Where should they start? Where can they find you? Where would you recommend they go first?
Great question. I mean, my best work is my books, so check them out first. I think besides that, I write a Substack and a newsletter. You can find it with my name, Steve Magness. I'm on the social media as well, even though I kind of hate them, but it's part of the game. So I try and do it in my own style, which is like just Steve nerding out on research. You can find me on Instagram, X, all those places at Steve Magness as well.
And that will all be linked in the show notes. Thank you so much, Steve, for being here on My Rejection Story.
Thanks so much for having me. This was a lot of fun.
Yeah, it was. You are listening to My Rejection Story, hosted by Alice Draper.